writers. Welcome to the first bonus episode of the Authorpreneur podcast. As you can probably guess by the title, this is my first Ask Me Anything on Writing and Story Structure show. In this episode, I will answer the top questions asked by my blog readers, YouTube subscribers, podcast listeners, and questions asked through my form on my website. As I prepared the notes for this episode, I decided not to include the names of the people asking the questions, and in many cases, I've also reworded the question asked because it contained details about the person's story idea or current work in progress. In a few cases, I decided not to reword the question because it needs a little bit of background information to provide an answer that makes sense. In a nutshell, I'm trying to respect the privacy of the people coming to me for advice. This decision comes from my background as a life and business coach and the coach and client agreement of confidentiality. However, in saying that, on my Ask a Question form, I do point out that I will share the answer both with them through email and in a public forum like my blog, YouTube channel, or podcast. I think the anonymity I provide gives people the freedom to ask those questions that can often feel too silly to ask. Quite often you're too scared to ask a question because it most likely has a simple answer, but it's not clear to you. Anyway, I hope all of that makes sense for you. I'm not 100% sure if I will continue answering these questions regularly on the podcast or over on my Patreon page once I finish setting it up, but I'll keep you posted once I make up my mind. So let's get into the questions. So how many words do you need in a chapter? There isn't a set number of words per chapter. Essentially, a chapter needs to be as long as it needs to be. But in saying that, it's important to note that you should write a story in scenes, not chapters. A scene is a unit of story that takes place in a specific location, time, and follows one point of view. If any of these elements changes, you essentially have a new scene. Whereas a chapter is a tool used to group scenes together in a logical flow. You can have one or many scenes within a chapter. The separation between scenes is shown as a single line break. Writing in scenes instead of chapters will help you understand the units of story, and it makes revision a little easier. Dividing your story into chapters should be the last thing you do after you revise your story and submit it to an editor. So in regards to the how many words question, you need as many words that will serve the story. It's okay to have chapters and scenes of varying length. Just know that there is no magic number of words. All of that matters is the story. How long does it take to write a novel? The answer to this question depends on how you define the word write. I define the word write as the entire publishing process from start to finish. However, most people are asking about the first draft phase. If I'm going to be perfectly honest, it's going to take longer than you expect. There's a ton of advice in the self-publishing world about writing a novel in a certain amount of days. However, if this is your first novel, I recommend a 12 to 18 month time frame. If you've been writing your novel for a longer period than this, that's fine as well. It's essential that you write and revise at a pace that works for you. However, if you want to stick to a 12 to 18 month time frame, then I recommend you follow this timeline. Month 1, develop your story idea and start outlining. Month 2 to 3, write your first draft. Month 4, give your manuscript a rest. Month 5 to 7, revise and rewrite your novel. Month 8 and onwards, hire professional editors for developmental editing, copy editing, and final proofreading, and do rewrites based on this feedback. Because this is your first novel, you don't have an audience waiting or are pre-selling your novel, so you have flexibility. The real secret to getting your novel onto the various online retailers is consistency. Work on your novel every day or most days of the week. Whatever writing time you have, be consistent about it. I've made this mistake with consistency enough times to realize its value. How do you know if you've done enough research to start writing? When you start researching the elements of your story idea, I recommend researching in stages. Create the premise, a synopsis, and a list of major scenes in the story. After this, start researching your story idea, then create a scene-by-scene outline of the story. Before you dive into writing the first draft, hold off for a moment and revise your outline. You may find at the outline stage that you need to go back and clarify a few things, so do a bit more research here as well. It's at this point you should start writing your first draft. The key to knowing when you've done enough research is doing enough to get started. So ask yourself the following question: can I write a good foundation for a story with the knowledge I have right now? Your first draft is a skeleton or the backbone of your story. You don't need to know everything, so research in stages. As you write, things will come up. I place an X or a keyword and highlight it and continue writing. At some point, you may need to stop and research while writing the first draft. Do this, but don't go back and edit. Continue writing with this new piece of knowledge and act as if the rest of the novel has been changed. After the first draft has been written, go back and make changes to your first draft. As you read through your first draft and start revising your manuscript, you'll probably do more research at this stage as well. That's okay too. Sometimes more research is necessary to create a stronger story. How do you flesh out a vague story idea? When I first got my idea for my novella Missing, the initial idea was the backbone of the very first scene in the story. As I started to research the world of archaeology, I expanded on the initial idea with the information I had acquired. This expanded idea led me to write the synopsis and a list of the most crucial scenes. After that, I turned to news from the archaeological world, which resulted in a fleshed out story idea with a scene-by-scene outline. The interesting thing about story ideas is an idea will tend to lead to another idea, so don't expect to have a fully developed idea straight away. You don't develop a story idea after one writing session. The easiest way to flesh out a story idea is to start researching. It's in the researching phase that your idea will grow into a more elaborate idea. Think of fleshing out a vague story idea as watering a plant. In order to see new green shoots, you need to water the plant over time. Write down ideas that come to you, and over time your story idea will flesh out into something bigger. What should you do when a scene in your novel is too similar to a scene in a TV show, movie, or another book? If you found a scene like this in your work, ask yourself these two questions as you read it over. Is the scene important to the overall story? Does the story make sense without it? If yes, move the scene to a deleted scenes folder. If the scene is important to your story, you need to ask a few more questions. Sometimes scenes are essential because they foreshadow moments at the end of your story or advance the plot. If this is where you're at, ask yourself the following questions. What needs to happen in this scene? Why does your character need to be at this particular location? What are the motivations of the characters in this scene? How can you do things differently? The next step is to brainstorm ideas for the scene. Don't choose the very first option that comes to mind. I've heard that you really should choose like the third option or the fourth option. Just don't choose the first one. The most important thing you can do in a situation like this is to strip the scene back to its most important elements. Think of new and interesting ways to execute the story goal the scene needs to achieve. What should you do when your story isn't working? I wrote my thriller novel Silence during NaNoWriMo back in 2016. At the time, Silence was supposed to be a prequel, but now it's book 2 in my James Lalonde series. In late 2017, I did a quick read through of the first draft and the issue with the story became clear to me. I had a problem with a few of the characters' motivations. As a result, the characters' actions don't make sense, and neither did the plot. I mean, it wasn't the entire plot, it was just one thing. Step number 1, get some distance from your manuscript. If you haven't already, I recommend taking a break from your manuscript. I'm not saying that you need to take a full year break from your story, but it's important to get some distance. Possibly a couple of months. The next step is to read through your manuscript and pay attention to story structure. Step 2, embrace story structure. Compare your story to 3-act structure. I don't have time to dive into the 3-act structure in this short video. However, if you want more information about 3-act structure, then check out season 1 of the Authorpreneur podcast. I'll include a link to this podcast below and in the show notes over my blog. Go through your manuscript and highlight the 3-act structure plot points in your novel. If you don't have a scene-by-scene outline, I recommend creating one in Excel or Word. Take a step back and pay attention to what is missing from your story. Step 3, create a plan of attack. Create a list of things you need to change or rewrite in your story. You might have to do more story research, add extra scenes, move scenes around in your story, or press delete. Just a side note, I don't actually recommend deleting work. Maybe it's a writer thing. Simply remove it from the manuscript and keep it in a folder of deleted scenes, just in case you change your mind later on. After that, continue writing the rest of your first draft, but only focus on one change at a time. And remember, you don't have to write the first draft in order, especially if you have a scene-by-scene outline. If you need to think about a scene for a little longer, then move on to write another scene and come back to that scene at a later date. Question number 7. If I was telling a story over 3 novellas, does each book need an inciting incident? There are 2 ways you can write a trilogy or a series. The first is a series of standalones similar to Harry Potter or Lee Child's Jack Reacher series. The second is a series of books where each part is a crucial piece of the story, similar to the Lord of the Rings or the Hunger Games trilogy. To answer your question, yes, each part of the trilogy needs a beginning, middle, and an end, and that's the basis of story structure. But the overall story can be resolved at the end of the series of books. But each book needs like a mini story. Things do need to wrap up at the end. Obviously, if you read a trilogy like Lord of the Rings, it would be weird starting with The Return of the King. It just would be, but each book has its own contained story. Like The Fellowship is obviously, spoiler alert, about the Fellowship of the Ring, about their first part of the journey, and it does wrap up, but I think it does from memory. It's been a very long time since I've read this, but I think it ends on a cliffhanger, possibly. Maybe not. It's kind of like a cliffhanger. You get the impression when you finish reading The Fellowship of the Ring, you want to read the next book. Is it The Two Towers? God, I'm such a nerd. How do you show the passing of time in fiction? Great question. This is something I struggled with when I wrote my first book. I was like, do I include everything? This is ridiculous. There are a few ways you can show the passing of time in thriller novels where you see the ticking time clock device. Chapters often start with titles that are a location or date, and sometimes both. But the most obvious choice is the start of a new scene. Remember, a scene is a unit of story that takes place in a specific location and time, as well as point of view. Therefore, if one of these changes, then you have a new scene. So in the context of a scene, I'm referring to the passing of time that isn't necessary to document for the story, because not all the events will happen one after the other. Another way you can show the passage of time is by starting a new chapter that focuses on a new event or story moment. But sometimes these ways of showing passing of time is not enough. In this case, you can explicitly point out how much time has passed since the previous scene or chapter. Quite often I've seen sentences of new chapters or scenes with a reference like 20 minutes later, 30 minutes later. You get the point, because if a character's doing something like running towards something, it's like running, you don't particularly want to show all of that detail, or you don't want to show their entire morning routine, because that's like boring unless they get stabbed during that morning routine, or they get, I don't know, burgled, or unless something happens within that morning routine that completely changes their world. And just make sure that you're not doing this consistently. You're not saying like 20 minutes later. Get creative about it. And sometimes it's okay to go from this scene to this scene, especially if it makes sense that they should go here next. Your reader is intelligent and they're going to realize, oh, stuff happened between here. You don't have to spoon feed them. And it's actually better if you don't. It leaves them room to create the world inside their mind and put a bit of them into the story and make the story their own. And this is is how each reader has a different experience, because if you leave a stuff out that isn't important that they can add in as they read. I hope that makes sense. Do you have a framework and things to think about when creating an outline? I love outlining. Yes, it's a bit weird, but it's the most creative part of the writing process for me. It's where I discovered the story. The first draft is more like a brain dump onto the page. First of all, I start by figuring out the key scenes of the story, aka 3-act structure plot points. After that, I flesh out everything that happens between these key scenes. I like to do all of my outlining using an Excel spreadsheet, but first I write the key scenes out in something like Evernote, then move to the Excel spreadsheet to use the columns. I know I'm a bit of a nerd. The spreadsheet I use has a ton of columns, so I won't bore you with the details. Now that I've almost finished writing my 3rd book, I've added extra columns that would have helped me when I first started. Here is a short list of 3 things to consider other than the obvious columns for scene description and point of view character. I'm trying to keep it to 3 because my spreadsheet has gotten a bit complicated. A more detailed explanation needs more time and room to explain than I have in this video. A day and time column helps me to keep track of the novel's timeline and that the events are occurring at a realistic pace. I have 2 columns for value shifts. This is a story device I got from Robert McKee and Sean Coyne from the Story Give podcast. Every scene in a story needs a value shift in order to give the scene purpose and move the plot forward. A shift can be from positive to negative, negative to positive, positive to negative and back to positive, negative to double negative, and positive to double positive. The 3rd thing you need to consider as you outline your scenes is the scene type. I got this from Chris Fox's book Plot Gardening, and I explained the 4 types of scenes in the 9th behind the scenes episode of my podcast. The title of this podcast episode is My Australia Trip, a free Scrivener tutorial, and blogging a novella. I'll add a link to this episode below, and if you're listening to the podcast, it'll be available in the show notes in your favorite podcasting app. So that concludes my first ever Ask Me Anything on Writing and Story Structure show. If you have a question that you'd love to ask me relating to writing fiction or non-fiction, then come on over to the blog and fill out the form at ameliahay.com/question. All questions answered in this and future shows will be listed on the frequently asked questions page at ameliahay.com/question/FAQ unless you ask me through my Patreon account. Thank you for watching and happy reading and writing, everybody.